Good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center, and it's my great honor and pleasure to serve as the moderator tonight at this wonderful occasion where we've come to celebrate the publication of two outstanding books and to grill the authors. These two books are great examples of what the Kennedy School does at its best in terms of research product, namely produce research that advances policy-relevant knowledge about issues that matter. And the challenge for our authors tonight will be, in brief, to help us better understand how the policy-relevant knowledge advanced in these two books can actually help folks like us better understand what's happening in the world around us, from the dramatic events in the Middle East every day now, to broader geopolitical trends like the rise of China. But we're extremely lucky to have two colleagues from the Kennedy School's faculty and associates of the Belfer Center and these two books. Now, you got a count of their resumes, so I would suspect most of you know. Joe is a distinguished university professor, former dean of the school, former assistant secretary of defense, and a not bad fisherman, I would say, since he and I have been fishing together for more decades than we can either remember, and probably have each told more fish stories than either would be prepared to do tonight. Monica Tuft is an associate professor here at the Kennedy School, and Monica has also been leading an effort that was initiated by our late colleague Sam Huntington and Brian Hare. And Monica is now the leader of this band, to try to better understand how religion may impact global affairs. And this book that we're talking about tonight of hers is a iteration in this exploration. She's also a student of international security generally, and has looked particularly at questions like how civil wars end in a sustainable fashion. So we're very lucky to have these two folks. And what I'm going to do initially is conduct a conversation among the three of us. And then we'll come to the audience, and all questions are in order. So I'd say think a little bit about your questions, and then there you go. We put up on the screen earlier the covers of the two books. One is called The Future of Power. This one has actually been published just this month by Professor Nye. The second, which is not yet published but will be so next month, On God's Century, Resurgent Religion and Global Politics, is by Monica. I'm advantaged for the conversation tonight in that I've had the opportunity to read both books. And even though I'm a colleague, I wouldn't hesitate to offer more critical views. I would say the amazing thing about these two books is they're extremely readable. So Ted Sorensen used to say about some books that this is a kind of book that if you lay it down, you would never pick it up again. That's not the case for these two books. Actually, you start reading them, and then you have trouble laying them down because they read, plus they're interesting. And so I would say good score on that count for both of these. Both of them also have a number of quite provocative ideas, not only about specific issues, but about ways to think about the specific issues. And that's really what I'd like to try to get at a little bit in our conversation for starting. So, Joe, let me start with you, if we would. elevator version of the argument. So just in a nutshell, what are the main ideas in the future of power that a reader should learn, and how would they apply to some examples? You've got at least, I mean, there's 10 big ideas here, but there's a big idea about the transition of power. There's a big idea about the diffusion of power. I find those concepts extremely helpful when I'm trying to understand what's now happening in Bahrain today, or whether something's going to happen in China. But so tell us a little bit about what's the core of the argument as applied to something. Yeah.
Well, the start of the book is to look at power and ask, what do we mean? How do we think about it? And power is simply the ability to affect others to get what you want. And you do it three ways. You can do it through coercion, sticks. You can do it through payments, carrots. Or you can do it through attraction and persuasion, getting others to want what you want. And if you're able to do that, you can save a lot on carrots and sticks. One of the problems we have is in American discussions of power, we tend to think just about those first two dimensions, either force or economic payments, which I call hard power, and we neglect soft power. As a congresswoman who's a friend of mine said, you're absolutely right about soft power, but if I stand up on a political stump and say something about it, I'm not going to get elected. Well, you know, that makes it hard to run a foreign policy. Hillary Clinton, when she was brought in as Secretary of State, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that she wanted a policy of smart power, which is a combination of hard and soft. But in our government, it's very hard to get people to pay attention to the soft side of it. If you look at what we spend on defense in DOD, and I was a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, so I'm not anti-defense, but it's vastly different from what we spend on state. We have a government which is one giant, the Defense Department, and a lot of pygmies, of which state is one. And that's not going to be adequate for the world we're dealing with. Traditionally, the way, if you went back to European history and read A.J.P. Taylor, the great Oxford historian, about how did you find a great power in the 19th century, it was the capacity to win at war. Today, it still matters if you have an army that can win at war, but in an information age, it matters just as much whose story wins as whose army wins. And we've seen a lot of that, for example, in recent weeks in the Middle East. So what I try to do in the book is, first of all, have a chapter laying out what is power, then looking at military power, economic power, and soft power and how they're changing, and then apply those to the two big power shifts that are going on in the 21st century. One is, as you said, Graham, is power diffusion, which is the movement of power away from all states to non-state actors. And that is a function of the information age. One way to think of that is, if you look what's happened to the price of computing and communications, it's dropped 1,000-fold in the last quarter of the 20th century. If the price of an automobile had dropped as rapidly as the price of computing power, you could buy a car today for $5. If the price of something goes down that dramatically, the barriers to entry vanish. So it's not that the state is replaced. It's still the most important actor, but the stage is a lot more crowded. There are all these other actors that can get on the stage with you. And that's new. That's something that we haven't seen. We've seen it illustrated, as I said, in Egypt or Tunisia, now in Bahrain, that the presence of a lot of information has created something new in the Middle East. It used to be, you said, you had no choice but either to support Mubarak or you got the Muslim Brotherhood and religious extremists. All this new information created a middle. It wasn't there before. And it also gave them coordination tools, Twitter and Facebook and so forth, to coordinate. And that's a new politics. That's something that we haven't seen. Anyway, that's power diffusion. And the book, I illustrate it with cyber power, which is a whole story in itself, but I won't go into it now. The other great shift of power in the 21st century is power transition, which is from one set of states to another set of states. And this is sometimes called the rise of Asia. It should be really the recovery of Asia. If you went back to the year 1800 and you took a picture of the world, Asia was more than half the world's population and more than half the world's product. Fast forward to 1900, take another snapshot, Asia is still more than half the world's population, only 20% of the world's product because of the Industrial Revolution in the West. What we see now is return to what you might call normal proportions. Starts with Japan in the 20th century, moves to Korea, the smaller Asian countries, now China, soon to India, and sometime in the middle of this century, we're going to be back to half and half in terms of Asia having half the world's population and half the world's product. Many times people use the wrong narrative for this. They say that this is the decline of the U.S. and the rise of China, and China is going to surpass the U.S. I won't go into the arguments in detail now, but in the book I try to give a lot of facts and figures of why I think this is wrong. Even when China is equal in size of the U.S. in its gross domestic product, sometime in the 2020s, being equal in size is not the same as being equal in composition of an economy. That's measured by per capita income, and China won't reach us in that level, if ever, until around the middle of the century. But what's more, these projections of China passing the U.S. are, I think, misleading, that they are usually one-dimensional. They look just at economics, and they neglect American military power and soft power, which are tremendously important, and which will, I think, be areas where the Americans will often stay ahead of the Chinese. And finally, you put this together, and we go back to this question of the rise of Asia. Asia is not one thing. If you look at Japan, you look at India, and you look at Vietnam and other countries, they're worried about the rise of China. They want the Americans there. It's as though Mexico and Canada wanted the Chinese as allies against the U.S. Part of the reason the Mexicans and Chinese don't have a Chinese alliance to balance us is our soft power makes us feel less of a threat to Mexicans and Canadians. But the Chinese haven't yet mastered soft power, though Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress of the Communist Party that they had to invest in it. It's very hard for them to do it, given their political system. So what I'm trying to do in the book is say, how is power, what is power, how is it changing, how well are we Americans adapted to this? And my answer is, until we learn how to really develop smart power, which integrates hard and soft power, we're not going to do very well in coping with this world. We need a more sophisticated narrative and understanding of power if we're going to develop the kinds of policies we need. Now, just in a footnote, as I finish this, I should point out that one of the areas where I'm not very good is on religion. So in this diffusion of power in non-state actors, what I would urge you to do is buy Monica's book.
Good, okay. We appreciate the second plug. And before we turn to Monica's book, it seems to me we should probably dissect Joe's argument a little further. So, Monica, I would suspect from reading your book that there are a substantial number of things with which you disagree with Joe's argument. So let's imagine Monica has now done her encomium for the future of power. There's 9 good things about it. I already know what those are. How about, what about the other side? Yes.
Well, see, I've been given the difficult task of debating Joe, and he's so reasonable that it's actually quite difficult, because when you read the book, he's got such a great modulated tone, and for him, he's talking about different ways in which power is changing, and he accepts and concedes that ancient conceptions like military power is still viable, and actually we need to count on it. But he's right. You know, cyber power is new. It's a new sort of power that we have to deal with. But there is another form of actors that are ancient and actually are harnessing that new power that I think are largely absent. And as a colleague, I really am offended. Joe, you know I've been working on this book, spending a lot of time doing research in the libraries to figure out. And the actors are, of course, religious actors. And we are witnessing, and I'm not going to go into the argument, I'll do that in a bit, you know, a global resurgence of religion. And when I first started this project about a decade ago, that was a question mark, actually 11 years ago before 9/11, about whether there was a global resurgence of religion, and there is. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of examples, Joe, that actually engage your argument, because if there's no better actor that can promote soft power, it is religious actors, because what is their currency of trade? It's ideas and values, and that is exactly what soft power is. So one is just liberation theology. I don't know, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of faith here. Liberation theology started in the 50s and the 60s, and it was all about sort of privileging the poor. This was an idea that the poor needed to be protected, and that the Catholic Church, Catholic elites, had an obligation to do that. It was codified in some ways by the Catholic Church in the Vatican II in the 1960s, with the idea that people have the right to dignity. Right? You didn't necessarily have to be Catholic, that human beings had a right to dignity and freedom. The 1967 war, we are still dealing with the after effects of that. And in no small part of it is the occupation of Holy Land, Jerusalem, by Jews. It is not a city planning problem. If it were, it would have been resolved. Right? It's because it's sacred territory. Yet Bill Clinton, when he was trying to negotiate the peace accords, the second day before they had to end it, if you remember, it was a very strict timetable, he sort of slaps his head and he says, "It's about Jerusalem, isn't it?" It's like, yes, President, it is about Jerusalem, and it's about the sacredness of Jerusalem, and that's why this is so intractable. Another is the rise of Shia political activism. This was new. It started in the 60s and the 70s in the universities and the theological institutions in Iran, and sort of this idea that Shia could challenge political authority. Prior to that, their sense of martyrdom, their sense of political activism was much more quietist. And it culminated in the Iranian Revolution. And Graham, where you have this concern about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, it's one of the most pressing foreign policy problems. And part of it, a big part of it, is the theological regime in place. Another is the interpretation and promulgation of jihad, which changed again in the 60s and the 70s in universities, that it now became a collective responsibility for individuals to go defend fellow Muslims. Prior to that, you didn't have sort of this offensive impulse to do that. Right? Again, a very important thing that the U.S. foreign policy is having to deal with it. And we're seeing fighters, jihadists, going to Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, Iraq, and guess what? Back to Afghanistan. So again, U.S. foreign policy, international global politics, highly engaged in that. It's a negative aspect of it. A positive is the role of John Paul II during the 1980s. We don't want to underestimate the degree or even overestimate the degree, but he was a very integral part in helping to delegitimate the communist systems in Eastern Europe. He was a Polish pope. It mattered. And when he went around in his pope-mobile, right, people listened. He inspired them. He was charismatic, right? And so it gave people a sense that in strength, that they could challenge and say, yes, these are corrupt and illegitimate regimes. And then, of course, the mother of them all is 9/11. And I remember a senior colleague of mine asked me as late as 2003, does religion really matter, Monica? And I looked at him and I almost said, you've got to be kidding, but it was a senior colleague. But I said, can I forward you Muhammad Atta's letter? It is written through of religious feeling and sentiment and what he felt he was doing. He was the head hijacker that went into the World Trade Center. And it was all about, for him, purification. Religious ideals behind that, his motivation and his actions. And then just thinking about your transnational faith-based organizations, the World Bank estimates that 50% of education and healthcare delivery in sub-Saharan Africa is done by faith-based organizations. That's extraordinary. And when they finally calculated that, it was under the direction of Paul Wolfenson, who brought this woman in, Catherine Marshall, and said, Catherine, the World Bank needs to find faith, a very secular institution, because guess what? Guess who's delivering all the aid that we keep funneling into these countries? Secular institutions are doing some of it, but so are faith-based organizations. And again, they're a very important actor. So, in my opinion, what this list reveals is there are a lot of different ways in which religious actors, both good and bad, using hard power, 9/11, terrorism, that sort of thing, but also soft power and influencing the dynamics within states and across states. So I was a little disappointed, Joe, just a little, that they were largely absent. I think you mentioned the Catholic Church twice, and it was in relation to the 1970s when actually the Catholic Church, I think where it really got going was the 80s. And then when we get to religion, it was largely talking about the cyber terrorism and Al-Qaeda, which is a very important part. Don't let me diminish this. I'm not saying that our religious actors are doing good. They're not. There are a lot of nasty religious actors out in the world, but there are a far larger number that are actually bringing peace and reconciliation and aid to many corners of the world that are desperately poor and desperately needy.
So let me see if I summarize,
Sure.
if I understand Monica's proposition, Joe, back to you, which is that if diffusion of power is a big factor, there's something missing in the index of your book, which is diffusion to religion or other. Guilty or innocent?
No, I'd plead guilty. I think Monica's right. I think the interesting question, I mean, religion has always been important. You can't go back and read about the Crusades without understanding a transnational religious movement.
Yeah.
The interesting question is, why has it become more important? And I think Monica gets a lot of credit for being ahead of the curve on this, of seeing this increase in importance. Conventional wisdom probably around Harvard 20, 30 years ago would have been, with modernization and secularization, religion would play less and less of a role. In fact, she's right. It plays more of a role. And I think one of the reasons for that is the reason that I give for, in the book, for why we've seen a great diffusion of power, which is the effect of globalization and the information revolution that I described earlier. Globalization disrupts people's identities. And if you disrupt a traditional identity, you search for something else. It might be nationalism, but it's often religion. It's often a strange form of religion, as Al-Qaeda represents. And the other thing is the information revolution, which provides this extraordinary amount of information and allows people to communicate. So that you might have had deeply religious Wahhabis in parts of Saudi Arabia 30 years ago, but the idea that they could now communicate so easily and effectively, I think has enhanced their importance. So I would say Monica is right, but she hasn't taught me well enough. I mean, it would be in the index of the book if she taught me better.
Very good. Joe, let me see you to press you just a little further on this as well. So here, none of us can avoid both the awe that one feels at what's happening in events in the Middle East right now, and also, I would say, if we're honest, some confusion or puzzlement. So in what way does the argument developed in Power help us better understand both what's happening and what might happen tomorrow or in a month or in 3 months?
Well, I think the argument in the Power book about the chapter on power diffusion argues that this extreme growth in information has transformed lots of things, and the Middle East is one. This isn't the first information revolution we've seen. Gutenberg's information revolution led to the Protestant Reformation. The difference now is not just the speed, but the relative accessibility. Everything is so cheap. Anybody, in 1970, if you wanted to be able to communicate from Riyadh to Rome to San Francisco simultaneously, you could do it. But it cost a lot. You had to be a government, a multinational corporation, or the Catholic Church to be able to afford this. Now anybody can afford that if they have price of entry into an internet cafe. If they have Skype, it's free. That gives a power to non-state actors, including religious actors, is one subset of it, which was never there before. And if you look at the Middle East, what we're seeing is there are a lot of actors who now can play in the middle of this stage who we thought previously were excluded. I mean, it really was very much the conventional wisdom that if you looked at Egypt, you had to choose and support Mubarak or you got the Muslim Brotherhood. The fact that there was a secular middle, and this is a non-religious group, is new. And it comes from this huge increase in information and then their ability to coordinate with each other. Now, we don't know the outcome of this yet. I mean, I was listening to Charlie Rose the other night, and he was arguing he had on an Egyptian demonstrator from Tahrir Square, and interestingly enough, the demonstrator had the good sense to say, we are bargaining with the army to delay elections. What? I thought you wanted elections tomorrow. No, elections tomorrow, and a religious group, the Muslim Brotherhood, even though it's only 15% of the population, according to recent polls, is going to win because they're organized. But if you have more time, these secular groups can organize and form political parties. So this protester was not saying to the military, elections within 3 months or else. He was saying, please don't have elections before 6 months. That's a very interesting sophistication. The other thing that they've done, which is absolutely fascinating, my son was talking to a friend who's working in Egypt. He said, they know that if they bargain with the army, the military's now in control, they know if they bargain with the army, they'll be accused of being co-opted. They make a compromise, they're going to be seen as co-opted. So what they do is on Facebook, they go out and ask, what are the things you want us to get from the army? Then they say, vote on these as to which of these are most important. And then they go and meet with the army in negotiations, and they immediately put down on Facebook what is being said, so that they can't be accused of sellouts or being co-opted. So this is new. This is, I mean, yes, Martin Luther tacked pages to the door, and Gutenberg did learn how to print. It was a long time before a lot of people could read, before you got the Protestant Revolution. This is going a lot faster, and it does empower some religious groups, but in this case, it empowers secularists.
Monica, let me take the question that I asked to Joe in the first instance to you. So, why should I read, or why should, since I have already, members of the audience read God's Century, Resurgent Religion and Global Politics? What's the kind of core of the argument, again, in the elevator? And apply it to something, maybe like the Middle East, but you pick it up.
Well, I think I think the core concern for people is, of course, when they think about religion, they think about violence. And so I think one reason to read it is actually we try to give a proper understanding of where that violence comes from. But then also we balance it with the many instances in which religious actors are actually engaged in democratization, right? It turns out if you look at democratization efforts from about 1974 to 2009, there were about 78 states that democratized, meaning they made substantial progress on the democratization front. Religious actors were involved in over 60% of them in a very substantial way, leading political parties, helping to provide demonstrations. So it's sort of to help people to understand that religion necessarily doesn't have to be feared. And I would hope, one of the reasons why people sort of don't like to talk about it is they're largely ignorant of it. It's not taught in the university. This is actually at Harvard, it's a very secular institution. When they were talking about changing the core, right, people thought that does not belong, culture, however defined, if religion is part of it, there was a lot of consternation about that. And part of that is this idea that we should not be talking about religion, faith, religious actors and that sort of thing. So what I would hope is that why people would want to read that is they can have a fuller understanding of the different ways in which religion engages on the political, in politics on a global scale. And so in a nutshell, the argument is and Joe said, we do pinpoint that there is a resurgence, and it's not relatively recent, it's not in the last decade. We actually track it back about 4 decades, and Joe's already alluded to one of the reasons. And one of them was the failure of modernization, which modernization theory, I'm an academic, right, we're in Harvard, predicted that secularism would trump religion, that religion, if it stayed, it would go into, it would be a private matter. And in fact, religious sociologists went so far as to say, Peter Berger, one of the leading religious sociologists, is actually quoted as saying in the 60s that any religious believers that are still around are going to be cowering in the corner alone. Right? And here we are today, of course, and people are wearing religion much more on the sleeve. And the question is why? Well, one is that modernization, these secular systems, think about communism, socialism, and to some extent capitalism, failed to deliver. They promised to eradicate poverty, war, and violence, and they did not do that. In many corners of the world in the post-colonial environment, populations were actually quite patient. And they gave their indigenous leaders, right, after the overthrow of the colonials, right, the bad guys, all right, you have a generation or two. Populations they understand. They're actually more mature than we give them credit. But then 1970s started rolling, and there were no transitions in power, and so people started challenging and saying, hey, where is my food? Where is my shelter? right? And who was delivering it? In many cases, religious authorities. They would go to the mosque, they would go to the church, and they were able to get goods and services from their local pastors or imams, right? So religion was there as a legitimate and already organized force when modernization was failing. The second thing, there are three trends that actually happened that converged together that allowed it to become political. That's sort of a social aspect of it, but that allowed it to become political was this democratization trend. Democracy is happening all over the globe. Right? Today, Joe actually reports this in his book, almost half the world's countries now have some form of democracy. That is unprecedented when you think about it in global terms. And he spends a lot of time on feudalism. Feudalism lasts for 100 years. Democracy is relatively new, but in the last decade or so, or last 40 years in particular, we've seen a tremendous wave of democracies. And some people are talking about, we were interested in the Arab Middle East, that this is the Muslim wave, that in the 70s and the 80s was a Catholic wave. And in part, again, why it was a Catholic wave was that religious actors were at the forefront of it. All right, and you can think about Poland, El Salvador, we can go through the list, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. So democratization really empowered religious actors, and their populations were saying, yeah, it would be they're less corrupt, they see them as more trustworthy, it would be okay if religious elites became political elites. And so you started seeing this movement into the political arena. And the third, which Joe's book does a terrific job on, is globalization. Religious actors, one of the things that makes them quite unique from states and nationalist actors is they're truly transnational. And so they follow trends, and where the church is where the members are. It's not where the physical location of the church is. And so they communicate, and they share ideas, they share values. And so with globalization, when that started taking off, right, so people, ideas, goods were moving much quicker at a far cheaper price and in much greater quantities, including religious ideas and religious actors. And so religious actors were really well positioned and in a particularly good position to harness that. And so we make the case that it was the convergence of these three broader trends that really was responsible for religious actors taking the political stage, both domestically within states and then globally across states. Now, the key question for all of us is why is it peaceful sometimes and why is it not peaceful others? And a key of it is you really do want to look at the political theology of the actors. So do they advocate violence? What do they see as the role with the state? Do they need to control the state, or are they willing to have a pluralist kind of system? But the second thing that's really important, and Joe talks about, is the centrality of the state itself. Is the state repressive? Does it allow religious actors to freely meet, to have public expression? And it turns out that those states that don't allow it, they push the religions underground, right? Or they actually try to decimate them. Those are the ones that have problems 10, 15 years later, right? And it's really striking. If you look at Egypt, the only opposition that's organized, that's really alive still, is what? A religious actor, the Muslim Brotherhood. What does this tell you about religion? It's very, very resilient. And part of it is because it helps provide values and legitimacy and organizational capacity for people, and people want it. Right? And democratization has shown that. So that's the argument in a nutshell. And so it was modernization, its failure to deliver, democracy, its promise to deliver, and then globalization, its capacity to deliver. And that religious actors, they were really able to harness those three things.
So Joe, then to you. So you wrote a book called Soft Power. And then you wrote another book that combined soft power and hard power, and you called it Smart Power, or a report. And then you write this on power. Is there another S in this series called spiritual power?
Clearly, and that's why you should buy God-centric. But spiritual power has been around for a long time. And the questions that we ought to ask is not, is there spiritual power, or has it been an important part of human history? Clearly has. But it's gone up and down at different times. I mean, when we're looking at Voltaire's France, it was on the downturn. The interesting question, I think, is why is it going back up now? And why are religious actors becoming, as Monica describes, a larger part of world politics than certainly anybody would have predicted around Harvard 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And that's, I think, where her theories are particularly important.
What about, but for both of you, but Monica, in the story you're telling, there seems to be at least one big elephant in the corner of the room that hasn't been heard from, and it's called China.
Yes.
So if I ask, what's the biggest geopolitical phenomena the last 30 years. It's a very poor country that's become a lot richer, and it's on a path, according to Joe's book, to surpass the U.S. in GDP in the 2020s. So this is maybe even in our lifetime. And you can say, well, who cares whether the U.S. economy is number 1 or number 2? Excuse me. I think I point a television camera on any group of Americans, and they think they're supposed to hold up their finger, number 1. So the Japanese may say, well, welcome to China's emergence as an economy. I don't think the Americans. And the last time I checked, China was not too friendly to religion and not too friendly to democracy. They're just about getting rich and getting powerful. So Monica, where's China in this book?
China is really interesting, Graham, because it turns out China likes evangelicals. Why does China like evangelicals? Because of the Protestant ethic. So it turns out if there's this terrific book called The End of Machismo, Evangelical Pentecostalism. It actually started in LA in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And then it spread. But now it's become much more indigenous. So it spread to Latin America, and many, many Christians are now evangelicals and Pentecostals, right? And the difference is that at this point it's largely a social movement. It's not a political movement, which is why China and actually a lot of governments are not very nervous about it. Because first of all, they tend to be individual pastors who run churches, and so there isn't this hierarchy that the Catholic Church has, that there's no diktats coming from Rome telling people what to do, which is why China does not like Rome or the Vatican. But in terms of the Pentecostal movement, so China, they've made real headway into the missionaries in China have made real headway. And China is taking notice because they think that it's helping their economic motor and their engine. And Latin America, some people believe that Latin American economies, to some extent, are actually doing as well as they are because, first of all, men are no longer drinking their paycheck away. They're showing up for work on time. They're committed to their families. And women are part of the organizational structure. So it's a way of actually capitalizing and bringing in a broader part of the population and more equitably handing out jobs and responsibilities. Women are not part of the actual hierarchy, though. That's still a problem in Pentecostalism. But in any event, so China is taking notice, and then of course it's sort of spreading South Korea. So the Pentecostal movement is something that we really want to keep an eye on. It's also Africa. Right? And if you look at what's happening in Africa, it's not only Muslim communities that are growing, but the Pentecostal movements. And what's really striking about it is they're now largely indigenous, and so they're self-perpetuating and self-regulating from here on out. And from the Chinese perspective, so the economic development potential of it, and then it's also helping with opium addiction. China's very concerned about that. And then also dealing with the aging population. If family is very important, then they have have an aging population. Families are smaller, but if you have this more connectedness and a sense of responsibility and value that Pentecostalism provides, China thinks that it might alleviate not all of their problems. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying religion is the panacea of all. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that it's an important part of the stories that are going to be unfolding in the coming generation.
Let me add a footnote to China and religion. It's interesting for decades, China had what you might call a secular religion, which was communism. Mm-hmm. That's gone. It's very hard to find anybody who really believes in communism. As the joke goes, the Chinese system is market Leninism. And it's the Leninist structure of the party that matters, not the communist belief. And in that world, the legitimacy of this ruling group, the Communist Party of China, is not from communism. It's from high economic growth, a very materialistic source of legitimacy, and from ethnic Han nationalism. And the Chinese government, under Mao Zedong, tried to basically destroy or outlaw traditional Chinese religion, if you want to call Confucianism religion. You can have a debate about that, but often it's called a religion or philosophy religion. Anyway, Mao, you were not to mention Confucius at all. Now, today, when Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress they had to increase their soft power, he basically created what? Confucius Institutes. So around the world, you have the Chinese government spending billions of dollars on broadcasting and creating Confucius institutes. And if you go to Red Square, or Tiananmen Square rather, in the center of Beijing, where Graham and I were both last month, you see Mao's great building, mausoleum, and so forth. Guess what's going up in Tiananmen Square? A great, huge statue of Confucius. And that's very interesting. But it's not the religious fervor of the evangelicals, the belief in the afterlife. It's looking at how can I manipulate a traditional religion to reinforce this legitimacy, which I need when my old secular religion of communism is gone.
Yeah, but I would add that's a little dangerous, right? Because
Very
it's
dangerous.
coming from the top, whereas the bottom, this Pentecostal, movement, we don't have hard numbers because, of course, China is quite nervous about organized religion because it's a potential extra authority. But in societies where the state sort of tries to impose its version of this, quite often it backfires.
Well, it's also dangerous because more widespread than the Pentecostals, who are still a very small minority, is nationalism. And as the Chinese government has unleashed ethnic Han nationalism, it's created something which is hard for them to control. So in talking to a friend of mine in Beijing about some of the pressures that the top leaders have been under to be more nationalistic, moving into the Spratly Islands or the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, where China and Japan dispute these islands, and China strongly overreacted. It's basically, in the last year or so, China's had a bad year in foreign policy. It's ruined its relations with Japan, with India, with Vietnam, and worsened them somewhat with the United States. And a lot of it grows out of nationalism. So I said to my friend, why don't they cool it, draw back? He said, because it's not that Hu Jintao or the top leaders want this. They want to follow Deng Xiaoping's classic advice of keep a low profile. But they actually read the blogosphere. There are 450 million Chinese on the internet. And the blogosphere is an enormous source of information to these leaders who otherwise can't allow free forms of flow of information. And as they read the blogosphere, they realize it's very nationalistic. And so if they start pulling back, they are being criticized. So it's like a sorcerer's apprentice that they've created. And it's not a religious sorcerer's apprentice. In this case, it's a secular nationalist sorcerer's apprentice.
Let me let the audience in on the conversation. The ground rules are there are microphones, 2 of them on either side of the floor here, and there are 2 microphones in the loges, 1 up. Please take your place at the microphone, introduce yourself, and questions should be to the point. So please.
Thank you. My name is Chen Zhen. I'm a visiting fellow from Ash Center Kennedy School. I'm here, actually both Professor Nye and Graham Allison, you are the reason why I'm here. I'm learning IR, and my focus is U.S.-China relations. And but I would like to raise another question. It's about my thesis. I'm doing research on media and foreign policy. And while I'm reading the papers, especially Professor Nye's paper about soft power, you mentioned that soft power is in first, agenda setting, second, framing, third, persuasion. It sounds very familiar for me, just like what media will function. So would you like to give more comments on the role of media? Do you think it's kind of soft power?
Well, media is an extraordinarily...
It's a very good summary of the soft power book, too. So.
It's yes, you read well. But media is a very important dimension of projection of soft power. The interesting question, though, is in an information age, what we have is an oversupply of information and a scarcity of attention, which means the scarce resource is credibility, so that you know which aspect of information to pay attention to. And the great danger of government-controlled media is it's not seen as credible. And so one of the real problems that, one of the problems the West has is you have a surplus of media outlets, and some of them are totally irresponsible and ridiculous, but you can always find another one to balance it off. But in China, with censorship, you basically don't have a free media. And that means that there's a suspicion of what the media are producing, which limits the soft power effect of the media. And it's not just media in terms of journals or TV and so forth. It also goes to film. When I was in Beijing a couple of years ago, I gave a lecture at Beijing University, and one of the students asked me, how can we increase China's soft power? And I said, I'll tell you the answer, but you're not going to like it. What you need to do is relax censorship. It's not that India, with Bollywood, which produces more films than Hollywood, has more good directors or better actors and actresses than China. It just has a lot fewer censors. And so the answer for China to be able to use its media to generate soft power is they've got to relax the censorship and control of the media. And that goes to the heart of this dilemma that China now faces, which is how do you maintain a Market-Leninist system? How do you maintain the legitimacy of the Communist Party if you have free media and an uncensored society? And I think the leaders are caught on that dilemma now.
Thank you.
Gentleman in the loge here.
I'm John Kaiser, a Mason Fellow here. I'd like to address my question to Professor Nye, and first of all, congratulate him on his wonderful book. Recently, William Hague revealed that the Foreign Office's computers, his own private office, were attacked by cybersecurity, cyber attacks by China. And in terms of Chinese power, I'd be interested to know what the professor thinks is how vulnerable the United States is to cyber attacks by China, and what implications that has for the balance of power in the decade ahead.
Well, it's a good and interesting question. Right now, we're just beginning to think through cyber. I was at the Munich Security Conference, which collects presidents and prime ministers. In fact, William Hague spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and he spoke about cyber. And as he pointed out, this is so recent, so rapid, that we haven't wrapped our minds around what a strategy is. So, for example, if you think of the web, it's only 20 years old. And if you look at how much traffic there was on the web in the 90s, it was in the millions. Today, it's 1.7 billion. This has grown so rapidly that we don't have a very good strategy for it. The Americans are probably ahead of any country in our capacities in offense in cyber, but we're also, because we depend on it more vulnerable. So China is doing well, and they're vulnerable too, but that vulnerability of the Americans gives opportunities for China. And the Chinese have found a variety of ways to exploit this, particularly not in attacks in the sense of bringing down the electrical system or something, which gets the press, but if you wanted to steal intellectual property, in the past you had to recruit a spy who might get caught and create a diplomatic incident. Now all you do is send some electrons across the border, and what's more, you can take out truckloads of intellectual property, which previously you could only take out a briefcase or two. And that's a huge difference. And at some point, we're going to have discussions between not just the US and China, but Russia and others, about developing some rules of the road for cyber. But we're just beginning this. As I said, in the 47 years that the Munich Security Conference has existed, as a premier security conference in the world, this year, in its 47th year, was the first time it's discussed cyber. As the president of Estonia said, who was there, said this isn't going to be the last time.
Just to put a footnote on that, the Belfer Center has put up a website, a blog, if you just go to the belfercenter.org, in which there's a very good submission by Dick Clark, who's a Belfer Fellow, on the cyber issue with specific reference to the Chinese threat. And the book that Clark and, I can't remember, Naki have done on cyber advances that argument, I think, in a way that's directly relevant. Monica, you want to say that?
Because it came out of Joe's book, but also in terms of doing the research for my book about how terrorists use the web and everything else. One of the interesting and important things that differentiates China from the U.S., and which makes the U.S. particularly vulnerable, is that much of our infrastructure is in private hands. And the government doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't want to regulate, it doesn't want to tax. People have talked about insurance companies, have private industry do it, right? You charge higher rates. But it makes it extraordinarily difficult, whereas China, much of the infrastructure is controlled by the government. If they want to enhance security, guess what? They're going to do it. Whereas in the United States, we're sort of behind the curve on this one because we have to figure out how to get our electrical grids built here, you know, natural gas and all of that sort of the ports and stuff more safe. And then the other aspect of it that I think why we're sort of behind is cybersecurity is very difficult as a field of scholarship because it's classified. Businesses don't want to share information about credit card fraud and that sort of thing. So it's difficult because governments don't want to release, of course, classified information. Then if you're doing scholarship, it's supposed to be open source. So it's a particularly difficult issue, and so Joe should be credited with sort of leading the forefront on trying to get a scholarly academic angle on this. And but it's given the nature of the subject, it's particularly difficult because you cannot get information.
This lady.
My name is Jane Giuliano. I am an associate with the Initiative on Religion and International Affairs. I have a question for Professor Toft. As I was listening to you, a question came up in my mind. It's kind of a general trend question, so I'm wondering if with all your research, can you compare the kind of religiosity you're seeing after modernity as compared to, you know, before Enlightenment and before modernity? You know, religion was a part of political systems way back when, but now in a very different way. I'm kind of wondering, what does that say about the quality of the way people relate to their religions, if you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we're going to go back. So Europe, as a result of the wars in Europe, so when we think about secularism and secularization theory, it really applied to Western Europe. And Western Europe, after a large portion of the European population, after decades of war, was decimated. I mean, really killed in large scale. They decided to take religion off the arena as an international political thing to fight about. And so they allowed the individual rulers to determine what the faith was, and you could either become that faith or you leave, or you become persecuted. And actually, so it ended up becoming a nationalist issue, actually. So if you lived in Germany, you were Protestant in the north and Catholic in the south. But I do think there are some corners of the world that have not gone through this, in the sense that they haven't gone through this Western secularization process. And so the whole theory is being reevaluated. And so people are trying to looking at it and saying that there are some corners in the world. So if you think about states that do have a marriage of religion and state that are more reminiscent of what we had prior to the Enlightenment. But I don't think we're going to go back. In Western Europe, in the United States, absolutely that's not going to go back. There's a very firm sense that religion and state have particular roles. By the way, religion is not completely absent from the political arena, public arena, even in Europe. I remember the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about possibly allowing Sharia law to be part of its code, and the British population just had conniptions. They went up in arms. And I think part of that is because there's deep Christian culture and norms, if not belief. Although I have news for you, 60% of Europeans still believe in God. So even there, and what we talk about, the de-Christianized, desecularized Europe. So to answer your question, Jane, I don't think that in some corners where you'll see where there's a marriage of church and state, but not in Western Europe, the United States, countries that sort of fell out of the treaties of Westphalia and then followed on with the Enlightenment and the principles that came out of that.
Thank you.
This gentleman.
Yeah, my name is Neil Hurley from Boston, and I had a question for Professor Toft. And when you mention resurgence of religion, a lot of people, I think, would think of Muslim, Al-Qaeda, terrorism. But it seems like in the last 10 years or so, there's been a resurgence in the U.S. of religion, at least in the political arena. And I'm just wondering if you see that as well, the impression I have from living all over the U.S. here, I would not say that this is a very religious country, compared to Middle East, where I've lived, where it's extremely religious. I mean, do you think there is a resurgence of religion in the U.S., and if so, do you think it'll have staying power in the decades to come?
Well, in the United States, it's stayed relatively flat in the last decade. It's something like 80% of Americans have faith is very important to them, and a good portion go to church on a weekly basis, about 60%. But generally speaking, the group that is growing the largest is atheists in this country. And some people make the argument that that's because they're sort of reacting to people who are more religious and want religion to have a more public face. And so now they're actually coming out and saying, I'm atheist, as sort of a counterpoint, a secular counterpoint. The good news in the United States is we actually have a very well-established system for where the proper role, the proper place of religion. We have the non-establishment clause. We're not going to privilege any faith. And then we have freedom to practice. And so the United States has a very healthy debate about the proper role of religion. But it plays a role in our politics. I mean, President Bush would not have won without the evangelical vote. It was the first time. It didn't matter that the Catholics usually had a vote in that. It's the first time the evangelicals actually on their own put somebody into office. So I think it is going to continue to play out. But given that we have this 200-plus year history of the codification in the Constitution about what the proper role is, and people respect that, that I don't think even if the country becomes more religious, I don't think it'll be a problem.
Okay. Gentleman in the loge.
Thank you very much, professors. My name is Ahmed Jalal. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. My question is...
from Pakistan.
From Pakistan, exactly. But it's nothing to do with Pakistan. My question is, in the 20th century, countries, big powers compete on the basis of resources. It was all about inputs. If you have a problem, if you have a challenge, you throw your resources at the problem, manpower and physical. Now, in the 21st century, the resources are going to be more widely dispersed, both human capital and resources. So countries have to compete on the basis of something else, just not on resources, and that is about attracting talent from different parts of the world to their own country and making the most of that talent. So competition has to be about attracting talent rather than having more resources. Now, in that sense, do you think that is an era for soft power, not even smart power, because you need this soft power to attract that kind of talent to your own country? And what is the role of religion in such a world, given the fact that religion, by its definition, is not inclusive, it's exclusive. So you might be evangelical or Confucian, but the fact that you have a label, it excludes so many people out of it. So you are no longer attracting that talent, which is not part of that pool. So what does religion say about that?
Well, let me start with the first half and let Monica answer the second half of your question. I agree with you. There are a lot of people who say, with scarcity of resources, we're going to have wars over resources in the 21st century. I think that's mistaken. I think it's old think. But I do think that your point is correct, that it's going to be much more talent and ideas and information that will be the key to success. And there you have to ask, how does a country attract others? The fact that there's 750,000 students in the United States from overseas is a tremendous source of soft power for the U.S. Then the question that is, of course, do they like the U.S.? Not everybody, but polls and the various studies have shown most do. Indeed, the fact that many are attracted to stay in the U.S. is a great source, through American soft power, is a great source of American strength. As Graham's and my former colleague Bill Perry used to say, we ought to take every diploma and staple a green card to it. But I think there's more than a joke behind this. I was talking about this with Lee Kuan Yew, and I quote him in the book. That we were having lunch last year, and I said, well, what do you think about whether China is going to pass the U.S. or not in this century? He said, no, he didn't think so. He said, China has an enormous talent pool to draw on, 1.3 billion people. So the U.S. has 7 billion to draw upon. And he said, what's more, once you attract them, the diversity in your culture allows you to recombine them in a creative way that China can't do because of ethnic Han nationalism. Unless we shoot ourselves in the foot by overreacting and destroying this openness, I think that soft power will indeed keep American lead in that area. But let me turn to Monica to answer the religious half.
Just before Monica, let me make a footnote. Joe mentioned Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense. He'll be here in the forum next Thursday at this time. So just for advertising.
And worth listening to.
Extremely. So, but
Yeah, I mean,
Monica,
if I were
please.
advising governments, what I would say is, and of course it's an ideal, but some countries do manage to achieve it, the United States included, and I think it's part of this integration of multiple confessions and ethnicities and that sort of thing, is pluralism and respect of freedom. And so you don't put up that we have a Confucian model or a Buddhist model or a Christian model or a Jewish model, that you actually have true pluralism, and we're going to protect that, which requires tolerance and civility. Right? And then it has to come from the bottom up, but then it also has to be signaled from the top down. And what makes me nervous about the Chinese is that a good portion of the population is not Confucian. They're also Buddhist, and then of course in their periphery, which they're very nervous about, they have a large Muslim population. Now, as a proportion of the population, it's relatively small, but they're in key strategic areas. They're in the border areas of China. And so if I were talking to the Chinese, I'd say, get that statue down or put up the Buddha next to it, right? Because you really want to do it. And I would talk about China as China, the place, not China, a place writ large as in space, not necessarily as a concrete set of values that are being promoted, unless they absolutely sort of encapsulate a more pluralist conception.
Just 1 second.
Gentleman in the loge.
Hi there. My name is Will MacDonald. I'm a mid-career from the UK over here at Kennedy. My question is to Professor Nye. Given here in the UK you see the rise of a kind of uber consumerism, I wonder if you thought that had any implications in terms of the kind of structure of power and the power distribution, and how you would see that playing out, and whether things like the Tea Party are a symptom of kind of that changing dynamic.
Well, I think both the UK and the United States in the first decade of this century overconsumed, and we saw the results of this. I mean, you not only had government consumption and dissaving, you had huge debts by private consumers, and you also had the housing bubble and bust. So I think we're paying a price for that. In both countries. The key question, I think, as I understand the UK situation, is they have decided they had to very quickly deal with the deficit. The Cameron government basically has taken some draconian budgetary measures, and now they've had a last quarter of growth that was negative. And if that continues, the wrong way to solve your deficit problem in the long run is to have low economic growth. In the American situation, partly on purpose and partly through our political blockage, we've kept up more fiscal stimulus and are now starting to think about how do you deal with the long-term deficit and the debt problem. I don't think we're going to solve much before 2012, before that election. But I wouldn't be surprised if the deficit and deficit reduction becomes a major issue in American politics. It's already a major issue in American politics. That it becomes a significant program which will have effects, which means dealing with the long-term issues of entitlements, not the kinds of things that people are talking about now of cutting discretionary spending, 12% of the budget. I think that's going to happen probably in the early part of this decade that we're in now. I don't know whether it's going to happen in Britain. You'd have to tell me on that. But it's a big question, and it's a crucial question, because if we're not able to come to terms with that deficit, it's going to severely weaken our hard power and our soft power for both countries. I think I don't know whether we're going to solve it, but it is interesting to note that there are, in principle, solutions. If you look at the Bowles-Simpson Commission, those are things which are doable. Whether we'll do them or not, I don't know. But if you ask, is this American situation an overconsumption impossible? Not necessarily. And you can see solutions. And the Tea Party movement actually may be a net plus. The fact that you have people in the political process, a little like Perot voters in '92, who are putting this as a priority issue. So I think it's still an open case in the American case. On the British case, I worry a little bit more because if you really go into a double dip in terms of your growth, then you're going to have a great dilemma. And let's hope that the last quarter of negative growth in Britain was an aberration and not a trend.
This gentleman.
My name is Brent Lane. I'm a cadet at the Coast Guard Academy. I was just wondering, with the spread of the recent revolutions to Bahrain, how do you think that President Obama will react using power and influence due to the fact that we have many assets and interests military-wise in that country?
Well, Bahrain
It's a
is
good
a
and
tough
specific
case.
question.
Yeah.
Good.
Bahrain's a very tough case because we have a naval base there. Fifth Fleet is based there. And that's important. I mean, we do have interests related to hard power, such as balancing Iran in the Persian Gulf. And the Fifth Fleet, with its headquarters in Bahrain, is an important part of this. So Obama can't just say, go with it, folks, you know, overthrow the monarchy, who cares what follows next. You had a Shia majority who came to power and was chaotically organized, and they, under Iranian influence, said get the naval base out of there. That would be costly in terms of our foreign policy objectives. On the other hand, to fail to see that you have to not only communicate with the government in hard power terms, but you have to communicate with civil society and develop a narrative which attracts them, it's like walking a tightrope. You have to do both. And I think in Egypt, where the administration had an analogous problem, they wobbled a lot on that tightrope, but eventually they crossed this chasm so far successfully. We don't know what's going to happen in Bahrain yet, but I hope that we don't make the mistake of focusing so much on short-term stability that we neglect that dynamic stability means getting your narrative out to the people in civil society.
Monica, do you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that, that it's going to have to be a combination. You know, there are absolute, grievances that are driving this, and the Obama administration acknowledges that and recognizes that, but then also the strategic interest. I mean, Egypt was an ally of the United States for a very long time. Mubarak was a friend to many in the States. But the population, under the repressive regime had had enough. It's the same thing in Bahrain, and it's the same thing in Yemen, and we're probably going to see it in Algeria. We're seeing it in Libya. And as Joe said, it's an incredible tightrope. But we do have a responsibility to those populations. Joe talks about the city upon the hill. Our soft power is premised on that, the idea that values, we don't want to say democratization, democracy promotion, that's sort of fallen out of favor, but basic human rights and dignity. I mean, in Egypt and Bahrain, one of the key terms that everybody is using is dignity. I just want to be acknowledged and respected as an individual, right? And so I think, again, the narrative, if we pick that up and say, yes, we hear you, we understand your grievances, but at the same time, I do think we have to talk about our strategic interests in the region and remind people that this is a bad neighborhood, and that we are there. We are not there to sort of take over, but help keep the peace. And that means we also have to make sure that there's stability in the governance, recognizing the rights of the citizens at the same time.
Thank you.
Sure, excuse me. This gentleman was next. Yes, in the lounge.
Thank you, sir. My name is Chaminda. I'm a Mason Fellow here at the Kennedy School. I'm from Sri Lanka, and my question is contrasting hard power and soft power. Countries like Sri Lanka, tiny countries, we don't really have much in terms of hard power, really. So where we can capitalize is on using a combination of strategic interests that we can garner and also soft power. So when I look at countries like Botswana in Southern Africa, I think they've kind of done a job of using the lack of corruption example to enhance their standing in the region. My question is, what are the examples that we can use in terms of bad and good in the world where countries that really don't have much in terms of hard power, small countries, small island states, have used what they do have and what they can do to enhance their standing in the international community?
Well, it's a very interesting point. Sometimes people think that soft power is just for big countries like the U.S. and China. Soft power is for anybody. It's a form of power, a form of being able to affect others to get what you want. We all use it as individuals, as groups, and small states use it as well as large states. Let me give you a couple examples, and then I'll bring it back to Sri Lanka. Take Singapore. Singapore has a fair amount of soft power because it's become a hub of a network in Southeast Asia. It uses ASEAN, it uses its universities to pull people together so that people are attracted to Singapore. But it doesn't neglect hard power. Sure, Singapore is 4 million people. It's never going to defeat Malaysia or Indonesia or China or whatever. It has a philosophy on its military capacity, what it calls becoming a poisoned shrimp. It's going to be so effective militarily that, yes, somebody else can swallow it, but they're going to get indigestion. Switzerland tried that during World War II, effectively. So Singapore is an example of smart power strategy for a very small country, using soft power and hard power. Norway, example. Norway has extremely well-run society. It takes its oil and puts it in a trust fund. It doesn't have a high level of corruption. It spends a lot of, it's about one of the few countries that spends about 1% of its GDP on overseas development assistance. Norway has more soft power than it would otherwise have because of these policy decisions it's made. So I would say the lesson from other small countries for Sri Lanka would be, your civil war is over, fortunately. You've defeated terrorism. Now bring the Tamils back in. Let the Sinhalese and the Tamil instead of trying to treat them as a defeated group, find ways to integrate them. If Sri Lanka is seen as a country which overcame terrorism and then turned to integration of its society, that's going to produce a lot of soft power for Sri Lanka. So that would be my application of that to the case you raised.
Okay. Last question for the gentleman here, please.
My name is Wang Huiyao, a visiting fellow at the Arch Center, Kennedy School. And I have the privilege of meeting both Professor Allison and Professor Nye last time at Woods Wilson China conference in Washington when I was visiting at the Brookings. My question would be like that, is that as we know that there's a globalization movement. I think the first movement is the globalization of goods, trade. Now China does the best probably. And the second globalization wave was the financial capital movement, and then US does the best. Now, I see the third wave of globalization is the globalization of talent, as Joseph and I just mentioned, that, for example, the US has the largest Chinese student now. Last year, take over India as the largest source of supply of Chinese students. And also, the Chinese immigrant was next to Mexico to the United States. And also, China became the largest investor immigrant category to the US. So my question would also, Obama is sending 100,000 students to China in the next 4 years. So would the globalization of talent be the third wave, and would that hugely impact the world, getting down all the barriers and the boundaries and with the information technology? So that would be the big trend after the first trend of trade and second trend of capital and the third trend of the talent.
I agree with that. I think the globalization of talent is very important. It obviously affects the hard power of a country, how it's able to produce and so forth, but it also affects the soft power. And one of the nice things, and I try to argue this in my book, is that we don't need to think of power just in zero-sum terms. If China increases its soft power in the United States, so more Americans have a positive view of China, that's good if we want to avoid conflict between the US and China. And if inside China there's an increase in the soft power of the United States, that can be good. So for those people who predict that China and the US will clash in this century, I think that's probably wrong. And I think one of the things that's particularly valuable is this interchange of talent. The fact that there are 125,000 Chinese students in the US, each one of them can help explain to other Americans that Chinese are not 10 feet tall and they're not demons, they're not dragons, they're people just like the rest of us. And for if Obama could get 100,000 American students into China over the next few years, as he said, which I hope he will, that would again help to explain to Chinese that Americans aren't 10 feet tall and aren't serpents, if you want. And I think the growth of Chinese soft power in the US and American soft power in China is a win-win situation. So I actually like this idea of a globalization of talent and of people moving back and forth. I think that in the long run is a very important way to manage international conflicts.
You want to say anything about this?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the witching hour, but let me say on behalf of all of us in the audience, including myself, how happy we are that Joe and Monica have both worked hard and produced these books, how interesting you've made the argument, and why I think at least many of you should have been persuaded. These are two books worth reading, so you can find them at the bookstore. We're not allowed to tout books here or to sell books here. I'm just recommending them on the basis as a reader for people that would like to get some further illumination of the buzzing, blooming confusion around us. So thank you very much. Good. Well, good.
That's fun. I think that format.
Yes. So you got to write a new book called Spiritual.
That's right, yeah.
Yes.
Joe.
Thank you. Yes.